The wind came first, a low moan across the endless plains of Wyoming. It was a lonely sound, the voice of a land that had never been tamed and never would be. It scoured the dust from the hard-packed earth, bent the stubborn yellowed grass flat, and carried the scent of rain from 100 miles away. Above the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a low, heavy ceiling of purple and gray that pressed down on the world, suffocating the light. There were no birds, no sound of life, just the wind and the vast, empty silence it failed to fill. This was a merciless country, a place that broke the things that could not bend. It cared nothing for hope or despair, for love or for ruin. It simply was, and a person was either strong enough to endure it, or they were swallowed by it. Eleanor Hayes, who had insisted everyone call her Nora since she was a girl, felt herself being swallowed. Her hands, raw and white-knuckled, gripped the reins of a single, exhausted horse pulling her small buggy. The leather was slick with a chilling rain that had started an hour ago as a fine mist and now fell in thick slanting sheets. Every gust of wind threatened to tear the reins from her grasp, to send the flimsy buggy skittering off the muddy track that passed for a road. Water dripped from the brim of her bonnet, tracing cold paths down her neck and soaking the collar of her once fine woolen coat. She was colder than she had ever been in her life, a deep invasive chill that seemed to have settled in her very bones. Her horse, a chestnut gelding named Jasper, stumbled again, his head hanging low. His breath came in ragged, steaming clouds. He was a city horse bred for paved streets and gentle Sunday rides in the park, not for this unforgiving wilderness. Like her, he was utterly out of place, a fragile thing in a world of stone and fury. She murmured soft words to him, her voice lost in the rising howl of the wind, but the encouragement sounded hollow even to her own ears. They were both failing. Inside the buggy, tucked beneath a damp oilcloth, were the last remnants of her former life. A small leather satchel held a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, a heavy purse with far less coin than she needed, and a silver locket on a delicate chain. Beside it, wrapped in canvas, was a wedding dress of white silk and lace, now hopelessly creased and bearing a long, deliberate tear down the bodice. She had made the tear herself, a final act of defiance in the suffocating quiet of her bedroom 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as the lightning that suddenly fractured the sky to the west. She was back in the parlor in St. Louis, the air thick with the scent of her father's cigar smoke and desperation. The crystal glasses on the mahogany table trembled, not from a coming storm, but from the force of her father's fist striking the wood. "It is done, Eleanor," he had said, his voice stripped of all its usual warmth. He would not meet her eyes, instead staring at a point on the wall just over her shoulder. "Mr. Sterling has agreed to forgive my debts, all of them. He is a generous man." Generous? The word had felt like poison on her tongue. Arthur Sterling was twice her age, a man whose hands lingered too long, and whose eyes stripped a woman bare in a single glance. He smelled of stale liquor and a clawing cologne that failed to mask the rot within him. He had buried 2 wives already, women who had faded into pale, silent ghosts under his roof. "You have sold me, father. You have sold me for a ledger book. I have saved us," he'd roared, his face purpling. "Do you think I had a choice? We would have been on the street. Sterling is a man of considerable influence. You will want for nothing. You will be his wife, and you will learn to be grateful." Later, Arthur Sterling had come call. He cornered her in the library, trapping her against a shelf of her father's leather-bound books. He'd pressed a damp kiss to her cheek, his breath hot and foul against her skin as his hand slid down her arm, his thumb pressing into the delicate bones of her wrist with bruising force. "You are a spirited filly, Eleanor," he'd whispered, his voice a greasy caress. "But you will learn your place. I enjoy a challenge." That night, she had laid out the wedding dress her mother had worn, a beautiful creation of silk and seed pearls. She had looked at her reflection in the Sheol glass, seeing not a bride, but a lamb being led to slaughter, with a cry that was half sob, half scream. She had taken her mother's sewing shears and sliced through the intricate lace of the bodice, the sound of tearing fabric a declaration of war. She packed her few valuables, the money she had saved from her pen allowance, and fled into the night, leaving behind a note that said only, "I choose to be nothing before I am yours." A violent boom of thunder jolted her back to the present. It was not a distant rumble, but a deafening crack that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. Jasper let out a terrified whinny, his eyes rolling wildly. He lunged forward, his hoof slipping and sliding in the deepening mud. The buggy fishtailed, its right wheel catching in a deep rut with a sickening splintering sound. The jolt threw Nora forward, her head striking the buggy's dashboard. For a moment, the world was a dizzying blur of gray sky and brown mud. When her vision cleared, she saw Jasper on his knees. He struggled, his powerful legs churning uselessly in the mire before collapsing onto his side with a great shuddering sigh. His flank rose and fell in shallow, exhausted pants. He was done. "No," Nora whispered, the word a small, desperate plea against the storm's roar. "No, Jasper, get up. Please get up." She climbed down from the buggy, her fine leather shoes sinking instantly into the cold, sucking mud. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked through her coat in seconds. She slogged to the horse's side, pulling at his harness, her hands clumsy and weak. He only turned his head, his large dark eye looking at her with a terrible final sort of understanding. He could not go on. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. She was miles from any town, stranded in a storm that was growing more violent by the minute. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against her, stealing her breath. She looked around at the vast, featureless landscape. There was nowhere to go, no shelter, nothing but the endless rolling plains and the furious sky. She could not die here, not after everything she had done to live. Leaving the horse, leaving the buggy and her useless, torn wedding dress, she took only the small satchel with her locket and letters. She would walk. She had to. She turned her face toward the west, where the road disappeared into a gray wall of rain, and took a step. The mud clung to her boots, heavy as lead. Another step. Her skirt weighted with water and mud, wrapped around her legs, trying to pull her down. The wind shrieked in her ears, a mad, howling chorus. She did not know how long she walked. Time dissolved into a miserable sequence of lifting one foot and then the other. Her world shrank to the few feet of muddy track in front of her, the stinging rain in her eyes, and the burning in her lungs. The cold was no longer a sensation. It was an entity, a living thing that was consuming her from the inside out. Her body began to tremble uncontrollably, not from fear anymore, but from a profound cellular exhaustion. The ghost of her father's voice swirled in the wind. "You are a foolish, ungrateful girl." Arthur Sterling's greasy whisper followed. "You will learn your place." She thought she heard a baby crying, the sound faint and heartbreaking. And for a delirious moment, she wondered if it was the child she would now never have. Her legs gave out. She did not fall so much as fold, her knees buckling as she sank into the mud. She tried to push herself up, her gloved hands sinking into the cold ooze, but her arms had no strength left. She lay there, her cheek pressed against the wet earth, the rain washing over her in relentless waves. The sky was growing dark, the afternoon surrendering to a premature twilight. She closed her eyes. It would be so easy to just sleep, to let the cold take her, to let the silence she had been running toward finally claim her. She was drifting, caught in a gray space between consciousness and oblivion, when a new sound cut through the storm. It was faint at first, a rhythmic beat, a squelching thud that was not the rain or the wind. It grew closer. A dark shape loomed out of the downpour, immense and solid, a horse and rider. She could not make out the details, only the imposing silhouette against the darkening sky. A man, he swung down from the saddle, his movement sure and steady. Heavy boots sank into the mud beside her. He knelt, and for a second she felt a flicker of terror. A lone woman, helpless on the road, but the fear was too much effort. She had nothing left to fight with. Rough, calloused hands touched her shoulder. Turning her over, she managed to open her eyes a slit. She saw a face weathered by sun and wind, framed by dark, wet hair. A thick beard and mustache covered his jaw, and a faint pale scar cut across his left cheekbone. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, the color of the storm clouds, and they held no malice, only a kind of grim assessment. He said nothing with an economy of movement that spoke of immense strength. He scooped her up into his arms, her head lulled against the rough wool of his coat. It smelled of wet leather, horse, and wood smoke. He carried her to his horse, a big dark beast that stood unmoving in the deluge, and settled her in front of him on the saddle. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, holding her against his chest. The warmth of his body was a shocking solid presence against her back. Then he spurred the horse onward, turning not west, but north, away from the road, and into the teeth of the wind. The ride was a jarring, painful blur. Nora drifted in and out of feverish haze, vaguely aware of the horse's powerful stride, the man's steadying arm, and the unending freezing rain. She saw glimpses of a landscape growing wilder, rockier. They crossed a rushing, swollen creek that pulled at the horse's legs. They climbed a steep, wooded hill. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of agony through her frozen limbs. She pressed her face against the man's chest, not for comfort, but simply to escape the biting wind. He remained silent, a solid, unmoving wall against the storm. Just when she thought she could not endure another moment, that her body would simply shatter from the cold and the motion. The horse stopped. Through the sheets of rain, she saw the dark outline of a small cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees. A curl of smoke rose bravely from its stone chimney, only to be torn apart by the wind. He dismounted, lifting her down from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. His cabin door, a heavy slab of wood, groaned open under his hand. He carried her inside and kicked it shut, plunging them into a warm, firelit dimness that was a shocking contrast to the raging world outside. The sudden silence was as loud as the storm had been. There was only the crackle of a healthy fire in a large stone hearth and the sound of the wind rattling the wooden shutters. He laid her down on a thick bear fur rug in front of the fire. The heat washed over her, painful at first, like 1,000 needles pricking her skin. Then slowly, blessedly, it began to seep into her frozen core. Her shivering intensified, her whole body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms. The man moved about the small one-room cabin with a quiet efficiency. He added another log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He lit an oil lamp, and its steady golden glow pushed back the shadows, revealing a space that was rustic and sparse, but clean and orderly. A simple bed was built into one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. Shelves on the wall held tins of food, a few books, and neatly stacked dishes. It was the home of a man who lived alone and expected no company. He came back to her side, kneeling on the rug. "Your clothes are soaked through," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken. "You'll catch a fever that'll kill you if you stay in them." Nora's mind was too foggy to protest, too weak to feel modesty. She could only nod, her teeth chattering. He was right. She could feel the icy dampness clinging to her skin beneath her many layers. His movements were deft and impersonal, like a doctor tending a patient. He unfastened the buttons of her coat, his large, scarred fingers surprisingly nimble. He pulled it off, then turned his attention to the bodice of her dress. The tiny buttons were a challenge, but he worked them free one by one. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on his task. There was no gentleness in his touch, but there was no cruelty either. It was a chaste urgency, a practical act of survival. He worked quickly, peeling away the wet layers of her dress, her chemise, her stockings, until she was clad only in her thin shift. He pulled a thick, clean wool blanket from a trunk at the foot of his bed and wrapped it tightly around her, tucking it under her chin. He gathered her wet clothes into a pile and moved them to the far side of the hearth to dry. Then he went to a small stove in the corner, ladled something from a pot into a tin mug, and brought it to her. He knelt and held the mug to her lips. "Broth," he said. "Drink it." It was hot and salty, and it burned a trail of life-saving warmth all the way down to her stomach. She drank it greedily, her trembling hands unable to hold the mug herself. He held it for her patiently until it was empty. He took the mug away and came back, pulling one of the wooden chairs closer to the fire. He sat down, his posture straight, his hands resting on his knees. He did not speak, simply watched the fire, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. The warmth, the broth, and the sheer relief of being out of the storm began to pull Nora down into a heavy, dreamless sleep. But before she succumbed, a flicker of her old self, the stubborn woman who had defied her father and fled St. Louis, surfaced. She could not simply lie here, saved by a silent stranger in a remote cabin without knowing. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, the heavy blanket pooling around her. Her voice was a hoarse, weak whisper. "Who are you?" The man turned his head slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers. The firelight carved deep shadows into the lines on his face. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady and direct. It was not an unkind look, but it was unsettling in its intensity, as if he were looking straight through her, weighing and measuring the trouble she had brought to his door. "Cole Maddox," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And you're my home. Get some rest." He turned back to the fire, his answer closing the conversation as surely as the heavy door had shut out the storm. Nora lay back down, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Cole Maddox. The name meant nothing to her. He was a stranger, a rough, quiet man with a scar on his face and a gentleness in his hands he seemed unaware of. She was in his cabin, in his debt, a world away from everything she had ever known. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song, and the rain beat a relentless rhythm on the roof. Inside, the fire crackled, a small beacon of warmth and light against the vast darkness. Nora closed her eyes, and as exhaustion finally claimed her, a single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek, its saltiness lost in the sound of the rain. The silent man named Cole kept his vigil by the fire, a solitary guardian against the long, dark night. Nora woke to a world of gray. A dim flat light filtered through the cabin's single cush-shuttered window, doing little to dispel the gloom. The fire in the hearth had been banked, its embers glowing a dull, sleepy red. For a long moment she lay still, her body a heavy aching thing, her mind a fog. The memory of the storm, of the collapsed horse, and the endless freezing rain returned not as a sharp recollection, but as a dull physical echo in her bones. She was warm. She was dry. She was alive. The effort to sit up sent a wave of dizziness through her, and the room tilted alarmingly. A low moan escaped her lips. Her skin was hot and tight, her throat a desert, and a feverish chill danced just beneath the surface, a cruel counterpoint to the warmth of the blankets. She saw her clothes dried and neatly folded on the chair Cole Maddox had occupied the night before. He was nowhere to be seen. The cabin was empty, save for the sound of the wind, which had not abated. If anything, its voice was higher now, a thin, sharp whistle that spoke of a deeper cold. She had to get up. She had to leave. She could not be a burden on this stranger. She was Eleanor Hayes, and she had always taken care of herself. With a grunt of effort, she swung her legs over the side of the simple cot she now realized she was lying in. He must have moved her from the floor in the night. The thought sent a strange, unsettling flutter through her. She pushed the heavy blanket away and tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately. The floor rushed up to meet her, and she would have fallen had a strong hand not suddenly clamped around her arm, steadying her. Cole Maddox stood over her, his presence filling the small cabin. He had appeared from nowhere, as silent as a shadow. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat dusted with white flakes, and the cold air clung to him. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was not angry, but it was stern, the kind of tone one used with a foolish child. "I have to. I must go," she stammered, her words slurring with weakness. He ignored her, lifting her with an ease that was almost insulting, and placing her back on the cot. He pulled the blankets up to her chin, his movements efficient and firm. "You're not going anywhere. You're burning with fever." He turned away from her, then shrugging off his coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Without looking at her, he went to the fire, stirred the embers to life, and added fresh wood. He moved with a contained, deliberate energy, every action having a clear purpose. He did not waste a single motion. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. Nora watched him, her head throbbing. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, with the hard, muscular grace of someone whose life was a constant physical struggle. He moved like a creature of this wilderness, perfectly adapted to its demands. She studied his face in the growing firelight. The scar on his cheek was old, a silvery line against his weathered skin. His dark hair was a little too long, curling over the collar of his flannel shirt, but it was his eyes that held her attention. They were the color of a winter sky, and they seemed to hold a permanent weariness, a deep, settled sadness that his stern expression could not quite conceal. He felt lonely. The thought was so clear, so certain. It startled her. This man was profoundly alone. He brought her a tin plate with a piece of hard biscuit and a strip of dried meat. When she shook her head, unable to imagine eating, he simply left it on the small crate beside the bed. A few minutes later, he returned with a steaming mug. "Drink this," he ordered. She wrinkled her nose at the bitter herbal smell. "What is it?" "Wild bark tea. It'll bring the fever down." He held it out. When she hesitated, his mouth tightened into a firm line. "You can drink it, or I can hold you down and pour it down your throat. Your choice." His bluntness shocked a flicker of defiance into her. She took the mug, her hands trembling, and sipped the foul-tasting brew. He watched her, his gray eyes unblinking, until she had drained the last drop. He took the empty mug and walked away without another word. He did not meet her eyes. In fact, she realized he had been deliberately avoiding her gaze ever since he found her in the cot. It was as if looking at her was a chore, a trespass he was unwilling to commit. His kindness was real. He had saved her life. He was tending to her, but it was a distant, impersonal sort of kindness, offered with the detached air of a man fulfilling a tiresome duty. The day dragged on in a slow, gray procession of hours. The tea and the enforced rest worked their magic, and by afternoon the fever had lessened its grip. The shaking stopped, and the ache in her bones subsided to a dull throb. Cole moved in and out of the cabin, tending to some unseen livestock in a lean-to. She could hear him building against the far wall of the cabin, chopping wood. His axe strokes a steady rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. Each time he came inside, he would check on her with a silent glance, add wood to the fire, and then find some task to occupy himself, cleaning a rifle, mending a piece of leather harness, anything to maintain the distance between them. The silence began to weigh on Nora more than the fever had. It was a heavy, suffocating thing filled with the things they were not saying. She was used to the noise of the city, the clatter of carriages, the endless chatter of society. This profound quiet, broken only by the storm, was unnerving. She felt a desperate need to fill it, to prove she was more than just a half-drowned creature he had dragged from the mud. "My horse," she said, her voice raspy. Cole looked up from a harness he was mending, his expression guarded. He didn't make it. Found him this morning. The cold and the fall. It was too much for him. Tears pricked Nora's eyes. Poor Jasper, another casualty of her desperate flight. "Oh." He seemed to sense her distress because his voice softened a fraction. It was quick. He didn't suffer. He returned his attention to his work, his message clear. The subject was closed. But Nora could not let the silence descend again. "My name is Nora Hayes." He grunted in acknowledgement, but did not look up. "I was traveling from St. Louis," she pressed on, the words spilling out of her now. "I was to be married." She paused, waiting for a question, an expression of interest. None came. He just kept stitching, his big hand surprisingly precise. The lack of judgment was in its own way. An invitation. He wasn't going to pry. If she wanted to speak, he would listen. If she didn't, he would let the silence stand. It was not a love match. She found herself saying, the words tasting like ash. "My father." He found himself in financial trouble. "The man, my fiancé. He offered to forgive the debts in exchange for me." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the blanket. "I would not be sold, so I ran." She finally risked a glance at him. He had stopped working. His hands were still, and he was staring into the fire, his profile rigid. For a long moment, he said nothing. Nora's heart sank. She had said too much. He would think her a fool, a disobedient daughter who had brought all this on herself. "Some men," Cole said at last, his voice a low growl, "ain't fit to be called fathers." He picked up his harness and resumed his stitching, and that was all. No condemnation, no pity, just a simple, stark statement that aligned him with her against them. It was more comforting than 100 words of sympathy would have been. In that moment, a fragile thread of trust was spun between them in the warm, fire-lit air of the cabin. As Cole worked, his mind drifted away from the storm and the woman in his bed. Her story, a simple tale of betrayal, had stirred something in him. An old ghost he had worked for years to keep buried. The sight of her sleeping, her face flushed with fever, her breath, a soft, shallow whisper, had reminded him so vividly of Sarah. He remembered the last winter. The border wars were over, but they had left him hollowed out, a man who had seen and done things that God would not forgive. He had come home to his small homestead in Kansas, hoping to wash the blood from his memory and the love of his wife and son. Sarah with her warm hands and her laughter that always sounded like sunshine. And Daniel, his boy, 5 years old with his mother's bright eyes and a boundless energy that Cole had treasured like a rare jewel. The fever had come on the wind, just like this storm. It had taken Daniel first, swift and cruel. Cole had held his son's small, hot body for 2 days, whispering stories and promises he knew were lies until the boy's ragged breaths had simply stopped. He remembered the terrible, final stillness. Sarah had held on for another week. She fought it, her spirit as fierce as ever, but her body grew weaker by the day. Cole had brewed the willow bark tea, just as he had for Nora. He had bathed Sarah's face with cool water. He had sat by her bed, holding her hand, watching the light in her eyes flicker and dim. "You have to live, Cole," she had whispered, her voice a dry rasp in one of her last lucid moments. "Don't let this break you. Don't you dare." But it had broken him. After he had buried her beside their son on the small hill overlooking the empty house, he had felt the final piece of his soul crumble to dust. He sold the homestead for pennies, packed a horse with what little he had left, and rode north. He had been riding ever since, taking odd jobs, driving cattle, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands in a place no one else wanted. A fortress against the world and the memories that haunted him. He had chosen this solitude. He had walled himself in. And now this woman, this Nora Hayes from St. Louis, had breached his walls as easily as if they were made of mist. He resented her for it. And God help him. He was terrified by the flicker of life she stirred in the deadened corners of his heart. By late afternoon, the rain had changed. Nora heard it first, a subtle shift in the sound against the roof. The steady drumming softened, replaced by a soft, hissing whisper. Cole stood and unbarred the shutter, peering out into the gloom. A blast of frigid air swept into the cabin. "What is it?" Nora asked, shivering. "Snow," he said, closing and barring the shutter again. "A blizzard by the looks of it. We're not going anywhere for a few days." The news settled in the small room, changing the atmosphere. Before they had been 2 strangers taking temporary shelter. Now they were prisoners. The isolation was no longer a matter of hours, but of days. The world outside was being erased, buried under a blanket of white, leaving only the 2 of them and the 4 walls of the cabin. The space between them seemed to shrink, the silence growing more charged, more intimate. They ate their evening meal in near silence. A simple stew of salted pork and beans that Cole had cooked. It was the most delicious thing Nora had ever tasted. The unspoken tension was thick enough to touch. Every accidental brush of his hand as he passed her the plate. Every time their eyes met for a fleeting second before one of them looked away was magnified in the quiet. Night fell, a deep absolute blackness beyond the windows. The wind rose to a fever pitch, a physical presence that battered the sturdy log walls. It screamed and moaned through the cracks, a symphony of desolation. Inside, the fire roared. a defiant beast holding the cold and dark at bay. Suddenly, a flash of brilliant white light illuminated the cabin, stark and instantaneous, followed a heartbeat later by a cataclysmic crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. It was not a distant rumble. It was right on top of them. The sound was a physical blow vibrating through the floorboards. Through Nora's bones, she cried out, instinctively pulling the blanket tighter around her. From outside came a sound of pure panic, a terrified, shrieking whinny from Cole's horse, followed by the splintering crash of wood. "Damn it," Cole swore, grabbing his heavy coat. The lean-to, "What are you doing?" Nora cried as he unbarred the door. "My horse. That lightning must have struck the big pine next to the cabin. He'll kill himself in his panic." He pulled the door open, and the blizzard surged inside. A vortex of wind and blinding snow. "Stay here. Bar the door behind me." He plunged out into the swirling chaos. For a moment, Nora obeyed. She sat frozen, listening to the storm and the muffled sounds of Cole's shouts to his horse. But the thought of being alone in the cabin, with only the thin wooden door between her and the raging storm, was unbearable. The primal, childish fear that had haunted her for weeks rose up and consumed her. She was more afraid of being left behind than she was of the storm itself. Ignoring his order, she threw off the blanket, grabbed her still damp coat, and ran out into the night. The cold was a stunning, brutal shock. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, and the snow, driven almost horizontally, stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. It was impossible to see more than a few feet. The world was a maelstrom of white and black. "Cole!" she screamed, her voice snatched away by the wind. She stumbled toward the sound of the horse, her bare feet sinking into the fast, deepening snow. She tripped over an unseen log, falling hard to her knees. The pain was sharp, but the cold was sharper. She struggled to rise, disoriented and terrified. A dark shape materialized beside her. A hand like a vice gripped her arm, hauling her to her feet. It was Cole, his face a mask of fury in the darkness. "I told you to stay inside." He roared over the wind, his voice raw with a terrifying anger. He was shaking her, his grip bruising. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" His anger was so potent it cut through her own fear. But underneath it, she felt something else. She felt the tremor in his hands. It was not just anger. It was fear. He was afraid for her. He began to drag her back toward the faint yellow glow of the cabin doorway. The snow swirled around them, trying to pull them apart. Her feet were numb, her mind reeling from the cold and the shock. As they reached the steps, she stumbled again, her legs refusing to hold her. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her to keep her from falling. She was pressed against his chest, her face buried in the rough, cold wool of his coat. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her cheek. In that moment, all her defenses, all her pride, all her carefully constructed walls crumbled into dust. There was only the storm, the cold, the darkness, and this one solid, living man holding her up. She clutched at his coat, her fingers digging into the thick fabric. She lifted her head, her eyes searching for his in the dark. "Don't let go of me tonight," she gasped, the words torn from the deepest part of her, a plea that was half terror and half a desperate, aching, longing for connection. She was not just talking about his physical grip. She was talking about everything. "Don't let me be alone. Don't let me face this darkness by myself." Her words hung in the tiny space between them, a fragile, trembling bridge across the chasm of their solitude. The fury in his face faltered, replaced by something complex and unreadable. He stared down at her, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. His grip on her arm loosened, his hand sliding down to her wrist, his thumbs stroking the delicate skin there in a touch that was so gentle, so unexpected, it made her breath catch in her throat. He did not speak. He simply held her there for a long moment as the blizzard raged around them. Their shared fear, raw and undeniable, melted into something else. It was a hesitant closeness, a silent, trembling acknowledgement that they were no longer just two strangers. They were two souls clinging to each other in the heart of a storm, and everything had changed. He led her back into the warmth, the blizzard howling at their heels as he barred the heavy door, shutting out the chaos once more. The silence that fell was different now, charged with the energy of what had passed between them on the doorstep. He did not let her go immediately. His hand was still firm on her wrist, a warm, solid anchor in the swirling confusion of her thoughts. Her own words echoed in her mind. "Don't let go of me tonight." A plea born of terror that had somehow become a confession of a deeper need. He guided her to the fire, his touch gentle on her arm. He knelt and removed her thin, useless slippers, his expression grim as he saw her feet, pale and icy from the snow. Without a word, he took her feet into his large, warm hands and began to chafe them, his thumbs working methodically to restore life to the frozen skin. The gesture was so intimate, so matter-of-fact in its tenderness, that it stole the breath from Nora's lungs. She watched the top of his dark head bent to his task and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to break her. This man, this stranger, had saved her, sheltered her, and now knelt at her feet, warming them with his own hands. After a lifetime of measured affections and conditional love, this simple, selfless act of care was more profound than any poetry she had ever read. That night marked a change. The storm, as if having spent its fury, settled into a steady, silent fall of snow that lasted for 3 more days. The world outside the cabin vanished completely, buried under a deep, pristine blanket of white. The wind quieted to a whisper. Inside their small fortress of logs and firelight, a fragile peace took root. They fell into a rhythm, a simple domesticity that felt both strange and deeply natural. Cole would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would tend the fire, then venture out into the blue-gray twilight to check on his horse and his snares. He always returned dusted with snow, his beard frosted with ice, bringing with him the clean, sharp scent of the frozen world. Nora would wake to the smell of coffee brewing and find a plate of food waiting for her. At first, she felt like a useless invalid, a burden. But as her strength returned, she began to claim her own space in their shared solitude. She took over the cooking, finding a surprising satisfaction in making nourishing meals from his simple stores of flour, beans, and salted meat. She learned the particular heat of the hearth, how to bake biscuits in a cast-iron skillet set on the embers. She tidied the cabin, folding his spare blankets, sweeping the floor with a handmade broom, bringing a small measure of order to his starkly masculine world. He never told her to do these things, but he accepted them with a quiet nod of acknowledgement that was more meaningful than thanks. They talked, not in long, flowing conversations, but in fragments of honesty offered up in the quiet moments. She told him about her mother, who had loved books and music and had died when Nora was just a girl. He listened, his head cocked slightly, as if the sound of her voice was a curiosity. He in turn told her about the land, the names of the trees, the way to read the clouds. He spoke of the animals of the high country, the elk, the bear, the lone wolf whose cry they sometimes heard in the deep of the night with a respect that bordered on reverence. He spoke of survival, of the hard, unyielding laws of the wilderness, but never of himself. His past remained a locked room. Nora began to see the world through his eyes. The endless white that had once seemed a terrifying void now held a serene and breathtaking beauty. She would stand at the window, watching the snow fall on the pines, each branch laden with a delicate weight of white. It was a world purified, all its harsh edges softened, its colors muted to a simple palette of white, green, and gray. It was clean. It was honest. It was everything her life in Sandine Lewis had not been. She saw the same quiet strength in Cole's solitude. He was not hiding from the world in bitterness. He was simply existing within it. On his own terms, he was a part of the landscape, as rugged and enduring as the mountains that rose in the distance. The weariness she had first seen in his eyes was still there. But now she saw what lay beneath it, a profound resilience, the strength of man who had endured the unthinkable and had simply kept on living. One afternoon, while telling him a story about a clumsy suitor at a St. Louis cotillion, a genuine, unforced laugh escaped her. The sound was so unexpected, so foreign in the quiet cabin that it startled them both. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her cheeks flushing. It was the first time she had truly laughed in months. Cole, who was sharpening a knife by the fire, looked up, his stern expression softened, and the corners of his mouth twitched upward into a slow, almost shy smile. It transformed his face, chasing the shadows from his eyes for a single, brilliant moment. The sight of it made Nora's heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar pang. The emotional walls between them, built of grief and fear and mistrust, were slowly crumbling, worn down by the shared days and the enforced intimacy. A current of awareness, of attraction began to flow between them, as silent and powerful as the river that ran beneath the ice in the valley below. On the fourth night, the snow stopped, the clouds parted, and a vast stardust sky was revealed. The moonlight, so bright it turned the snow-covered world to silver. The silence was absolute, a holy stillness. After their meal, Nora found herself humming a tune, a slow, sad waltz her mother used to play on the piano. Cole looked up from the book he was reading, his expression questioning. "It's just a song my mother loved," she said softly. He closed the book and set it aside. He watched her for a long moment, the firelight flickering in his eyes. An unspoken question passed between them. "I don't suppose you know how to dance, Mr. Maddox," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper, a blush creeping up her neck. He was silent for so long she thought he would refuse. Then he stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small cabin. "My wife, Sarah, she tried to teach me once," he said, his voice rough with memory. He held out his hand. "I was not a good student." Nora's heart leaped. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. He led her to the small, open space in front of the hearth and tentatively placed his other hand on her waist. She rested her hand on his shoulder. It was a formal, proper hold, yet it felt more electrifying than any touch she had ever known. She began to hum the waltz again, her voice soft in the quiet room, awkwardly at first. Then, with a growing confidence, he began to lead her in a slow, shuffling circle. They moved without speaking, their steps whispering on the wooden floorboards. The firelight cast their dancing shadows against the log walls, making them seem larger than life. It softened the harsh lines of his face and turned her hair to spun gold. In that moment, they were not a fugitive and a hermit. They were simply a man and a woman, moving as one to a melody of memory and moonlight. He drew her a little closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heart, smell the faint, clean scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the pain of the past weeks melted away, leaving only this perfect, fragile moment of peace. The song ended, and she stopped humming, but they did not stop moving. He held her, his hand warm on the small of her back. She lifted her head, her face just inches from his. His gray eyes were dark with an emotion she could not name, a mixture of longing and a deep, profound sorrow. He lowered his head, his gaze dropping to her lips. She saw the intent in his eyes, and her own lips parted in anticipation. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was going to kiss her, but just as his lips were about to touch hers, a shadow passed over his face. He flinched as if struck, his eyes clouding over with guilt and grief. The ghost of his wife. Sarah had entered the room and stood between them. With a choked sound, he abruptly pulled away, dropping his hands as if he had been burned. He turned his back to her and stared into the fire, his shoulders rigid. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice thick. "I cannot." The rejection was a physical blow, sharp and cold. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, hiding the hurt, hiding the bitter sting of disappointment. "It is I who should be sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was improper of me." She retreated to her cut, and he remained by the fire, a silent, brooding statue. The beautiful, fragile moment was shattered, and the walls between them were back up, higher and colder than before. 2 days later, the sun finally returned, brilliant and blinding on the fresh snow. The world reemerged, sharp and clear. With the sun came a visitor. A sharp, loud knock on the door made them both freeze. Cole's hand went instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. He motioned for Nora to be silent, to move to the corner of the cabin. Out of sight of the door, he unbarred the door and opened at a crack. A man sat on a large black horse, his figure silhouetted against the bright snow. He was a big man wrapped in buffalo hides with a thick, unkempt beard and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. A rifle was slung across his saddle. "Howdy," the man said, his voice a grawly rumble, named Silas Kane. "Seeing as you're the only soul I've seen in 50 miles, thought I'd ask if you've seen anyone passing through this way before the storm hit." "Haven't seen a soul," Cole said, his voice flat and even. He blocked the doorway with his body, his stance casual but firm. Silas Kane's eyes narrowed, his gaze sweeping past Cole, trying to pierce the shadows of the cabin, looking for a woman, young, dark hair, fancy city clothes. "Ran off from St. Louis. There's a hefty reward for her return. Her fiancé wants her back real bad." Nora's blood ran cold. She pressed herself tighter into the corner, hardly daring to breathe. "Like I said," Cole repeated, his tone unchanged. "Just me here. Been snowed in for the better part of a week." Kane spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow, his little eyes glinting. "Funny thing, found a dead horse down in the valley. A city horse by the look of it. Buggy nearby. Busted up. Looked like someone left it in a hurry." He let the words hang in the air. His gaze flickered to the side of the hearth where Nora's boots, now clean and dry, were sitting. They were small, delicate things, clearly not a man's boots. Cole didn't flinch. Lots of folks lose their way out here. This country is unforgiving. That it is, Kane agreed, a humorless smile twisting his lips. He gathered his reins. "Well, I'll leave you to it. Just some friendly advice, friend. A man don't want to get himself mixed up in trouble with rich folks from a city. They have long arms and deep pockets, especially for a girl who ran out on a man like Arthur Sterling." The name struck Nora with the force of a physical blow. Sterling. He had sent bounty hunters after her. Cole gave a slow nod. "I'll keep that in mind." Kane gave one last long searching look at the cabin's dark interior before turning his horse and riding away, his dark shape shrinking against the vast white landscape. Cole closed the door and barred, the heavy thud echoing the frantic beating of Nora's heart. He turned and leaned against the door, his eyes closed, his knuckles white where he gripped the wooden bar. The calm, steady facade he had shown the bounty hunter had vanished, revealing the tension beneath. The reality of her situation came crashing down on Nora with suffocating force. She was not just a runaway. She was a fugitive. She was wanted. There was a price on her head. She had brought this danger, this threat to the door of the one man who had shown her kindness. A sob broke from her throat, a ragged, ugly sound. She sank to the floor, her face in her hands, the carefully constructed composure of the past few days shattering into a million pieces. "He knows," she wept. "He knows I am here. He'll come back." Cole crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt in front of her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid, comforting weight. "He suspects he doesn't know for sure. You lied for me," she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes flooded with tears. "You could be arrested. Or worse, that man. He looked like a killer." "He is what he is," Cole said grimly. "And I did what I had to do." "You do not understand," she cried, the whole sordid story pouring out of her in a desperate, broken torrent. "My father did not just arrange a marriage. He took money from Arthur Sterling, a great deal of it for business ventures that failed. He used me to settle the debt. It was not just an engagement. It was a contract. I was property being transferred. If he finds me, he will not just take me back to St. Louis. He will own me. He will do whatever he pleases. He told me as much." She finally confessed the whole ugly truth, a truth she had barely admitted to herself. She had not just run from a loveless marriage. She had run from a form of slavery. Cole listened, his face carved from stone. The moral weight of his decision settled visibly upon him. He was not just sheltering a runaway girl. He was hiding a piece of property, defying a powerful man, and breaking the law. He was a man who had sought only to be left alone. And now he was entangled in a conflict that could cost him his freedom or his life. He looked at Nora, weeping on the floor of his cabin, and saw not the trouble she represented, but the terrified, cornered soul who had trusted him with her life. He had lied to Silas Kane without a second thought, an instinct to protect overriding all caution. Now faced with the full truth, he felt the cold grip of fear. But beneath the fear was something else, something stubborn and unyielding. He had spent years running from connection, from caring about another living soul. But Nora had slipped past his defenses. He had chosen to protect her. He had made her problem his problem. Their bond, forged in the crucible of the storm, was now sealed in a shared secret and a common enemy. It was a dangerous, forbidden affection, a fragile peace built in defiance of the world's cruelty. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in that shared glance, they both knew that their solitude was over. They were in this together, for better or for worse. The thought came slowly. Then all at once, for days, the world was filled with the sound of dripping water. A soft, persistent percussion as the sun began to reclaim the valley. Icicles wept from the cabin eaves, and the deep drifts of snow sighed and settled. Their pristine white surfaces pocked and soiled. Rivulets of melt water carved new paths through the mud. And the air, once sharp and sterile with frost, grew heavy with the rich, lo-mai scent of awakening earth. Spring was not a gentle arrival. It was a messy, chaotic unraveling. And with it came the stark and unavoidable truth that Nora could not stay hidden forever. The melting snow cleared the roads, and the world that had been held at bay by the blizzard was now free to intrude. The shadow of Silas Kane, the bounty hunter, loomed over their fragile sanctuary. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every unfamiliar cry of a bird sent a jolt of anxiety through Nora. They were living on borrowed time. Cole felt it, too. The quieties that had begun to grow between them was replaced by a taut, restless energy. He began to work on her damaged buggy, the one he had dragged up from the valley floor. He was a capable craftsman, his hands sure and steady as he fashioned a new wheel spoke from a piece of seasoned ash, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear, cold air. Nora would bring him water or a hot cup of coffee, and they would stand for a moment in the pale sunlight, the buggy between them like a barricade. Every gesture, every necessary task completed, felt less like a repair and more like a preparation for goodbye. The axle is sound, he would say, his eyes on his work. Another day or two, and she will be fit for travel. You are very skilled, she would reply, her voice too bright, and the conversation would die there, starved for the words they could not bring themselves to speak. Their nights grew quieter, the silence between them stretching thin and tight with unspoken longing. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the crackling fire a poor substitute for the warmth they had briefly shared. Nora would watch the flames dance across the rugged planes of his face, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way a stray lock of hair fell across his brow, the deep-seated sorrow in his eyes. He would catch her looking, and their gazes would hold for a breathless moment, a silent, aching conversation taking place in the space between them. Then he would look away, his expression shuddering, and the wall would be back in place. One evening, as a lavender twilight bled across the snow-streaked mountains, Nora could bear the silence no longer. Cole was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice small in the quiet room. "When I leave, I will not go back east. I will go west. California, perhaps, or Oregon. Somewhere I can be new." She looked at her hands, twisting a loose thread in her skirt. "I dream of starting over. A small house, a garden, a place where no one knows the name." Eleanor Hayes. Cole stopped his work, his hands stilling on the rifle stock. He stared into the fire, his profile grim. "There is no such place," he said, his voice low and hard. "A person cannot outrun who they are. The world is smaller than you think. Men like Sterling, their reach is long." His words were meant to be a dose of reality, but they felt like a dismissal of her only hope. The fragile dream she had been nurturing withered in the face of his bleak certainty. "So I am to be haunted forever," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. He did not answer. He simply sat there, a man imprisoned by his own ghosts, telling her that she too would never be free. A wave of defiant love, sharp and painful, surged through her. "Then I'll be nobody with you," she said, her voice soft but clear. Each word a vow. The statement, so simple and so absolute, struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, his head turning toward her. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a raw, agonizing conflict. She had offered him everything, her entire future, and laid it at his feet. She saw the longing in his eyes, the desperate wish to accept the gift she offered, but she also saw the shadows, the ghosts of a woman and a child that stood between them, their spectral hands holding him back. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tight, his silence a more painful rejection than any words could have been. That silence was the thing that finally broke them. It was the last thread of restraint, and it snapped. The unspoken tension that had simmered between them for days erupted into a firestorm. He stood, and she stood, and they met in the middle of the room as if pulled by an invisible force. His hands came up to cup her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks with a desperate tenderness. "Nora," he breathed her name, a prayer and a curse on his lips. And then he was kissing her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of starvation, of a man who had denied himself for years, and a woman who had never known such consuming passion. It was fierce and desperate, a collision of loneliness and longing, of grief and hope. His mouth was hard and demanding on hers, and she answered with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, wanting to erase any space that remained between them. He swept her into his arms and carried her to his cot, their mouths never parting. The fading sunset cast long golden rays through the window, bathing them in a warm, ethereal light. He laid her down on the rough blankets, his body covering hers, and in the dying light of the day, they gave into the desire that had been building between them since the first night of the storm. It was not just passion. It was a desperate, frantic search for solace. Every touch was a question, every kiss an answer. She explored the hard landscape of his body, her fingers tracing the old silvery scar on his cheek, the knotted muscles of his shoulders, the landscape of a life lived through hardship. He in turn worshipped her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, his hands gentle on her softer skin as if he were afraid she might break. It was a union filled with a heartbreaking tenderness and a profound shared pain. Two broken souls clinging to each other, seeking a momentary refuge from the cruelty of the world in his arms for a few fleeting hours. Nora felt completely and utterly safe. But as the last light faded from the sky, plunging the cabin into the deep blue of twilight, the guilt returned to claim him after the fierce storm of their passion had passed. A cold, heavy stillness settled in its place. He withdrew from her, not just physically, but emotionally. He rose from the bed without a word and began to dress, his back to her. The wall was back, higher and more impenetrable than ever. "Cole," she whispered into the darkness. He did not turn. "I should not have done that," he said, his voice a dead-flat thing. It was a mistake. Each word was a splinter of ice in her heart. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the self-loathing in his posture, and she understood he was not rejecting her. He was rejecting himself. He was a man who believed he had no right to happiness, no right to love another after the family he had lost. He was betraying the memory of his wife, and the guilt was consuming him. Heartbroken, but fiercely proud, Nora did not plead. She would not be another ghost to haunt him. She watched as he took a blanket and went to sit in the chair by the cold hearth, a solitary sentinel guarding his own grief. She lay awake for hours in the darkness, the scent of him still on her skin, the ache in her heart, a cold, heavy stone. She had offered him her love, and he could not take it. And she knew with a terrible certainty that as long as she was here, she was a constant reminder of his perceived betrayal. She was the danger that had come to his door, and the world would take him down with her if she stayed. Her decision was made in the silent, lonely hours before dawn. It was an act of love, the only one she had left to give. She would leave. She would disappear from his life and take her trouble with her. She would save him from herself. She rose silently, the first hint of gray light filtering through the window. Cole was asleep in the chair, his head slumped to his chest, his face etched with exhaustion. Even in sleep, her heart twisted with love and pity. She dressed quietly, her hands shaking as she pulled on her boots. She gathered her few possessions, the locket, the letters, the small purse of money. She looked at the cabin, this small space that had been her sanctuary, and memorized every detail. She was stuffing her belongings into her satchel, her back to the door, when the world exploded. A gunshot, deafeningly loud, shattered the morning quiet. The window beside her disintegrated into a shower of glass. Wood splintered from the wall just above her head. She screamed, dropping to the floor, her heart seizing with terror. Cole was on his feet in an instant, a feral snarl on his face. He shoved her behind the heavy wooden table, his body shielding hers. "Stay down," he roared. Another shot rang out, ripping through the heavy plank of the door. From outside, Silas Kane's growly voice called out, "Come on out, Maddox. Send out the girl, and I might let you live. I know she's in there." Cole grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall, his movements swift and sure. "He won't take you, Nora," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. He glanced down at her, and in his eyes she saw not the haunted, guilt-ridden man from the night before, but a fierce, protective warrior. All his distance was gone, burned away by the immediate threat. He moved to the side of the shattered window, keeping low. "You're on out of here, Kane," Cole shouted. "She's not with me." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I ain't leaving without my bounty." A third shot came, but this one was followed by Cole's sharp, guttural cry of pain. He staggered back from the window, his rifle clattering to the floor. A dark red stain was spreading rapidly across his left shoulder and chest. He collapsed to his knees, his face pale with shock and pain. "Cole!" Nora screamed, scrambling out from behind the table. "Stay back," he gasped, trying to reach for his rifle. The cabin door burst open, kicked in with a heavy boot. Silas Kane stood there, a smoking pistol in his hand, a triumphant, predatory grin on his face. His eyes fixed on Nora, gleaming with greed. "There you are, little bird. Time to go home." He started toward her, holstering his pistol as if the fight was already over. But he had underestimated her. The refined woman from St. Louis was gone, burned away in the fire of the last few weeks. In her place was a survivor. Seeing Cole bleeding on the floor, seeing the cruel victory in Kane's eyes, something inside her snapped, a primal rage, cold and clear, surged through her. She did not think. She acted. Her eyes darted around the room and fixed on the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. As Kane reached for her, she lunged sideways, grabbing the poker, its weight solid and deadly in her hands. He turned, surprised by her sudden movement. She swung it with all her strength, a desperate, two-handed blow that caught him square in the side of the head. There was a sickening crack. The grin vanished from his face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His eyes went wide, then glazed over. He swayed on his feet for a moment before crashing to the floor like a felled tree, his head landing inches from Cole's outstretched hand. He did not move again. A terrible ringing silence filled the cabin, broken only by Nora's ragged, hysterical breaths. The iron poker fell from her numb fingers, clattering on the floorboards. Her hands were shaking so violently she could not control them. She looked down at her dress and saw a spatter of blood across the bodice. His blood. She had killed a man. The horror of it threatened to swallow her, but the sight of Cole brought her back. He was slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed. The front of his shirt was soaked in blood. "Cole!" she sobbed, crawling to his side. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, her hands clumsy and slick, and pressed it against the wound, trying to staunch the terrifying flow of blood. "Silly, open your eyes, please." He stirred, his eyelids fluttering, his gaze cloudy with pain, found hers. He tried to speak, but only a bloody froth appeared on his lips. Panic seized her. He was dying. He was dying for her. She leaned over him, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with his sweat and blood. She pressed her forehead to his, clinging to him as if she could hold him to life through sheer force of will. The words that had first bound them together, the plea that had broken through his solitude, came tumbling from her lips, a desperate, chanted prayer. "Don't let go of me tonight," she wept, her voice breaking. "Please, Cole, don't let go." The ringing in Nora's ears subsided, replaced by the horrifyingly intimate sound of Cole's labored breathing. For a long, paralyzed moment, she could only stare at the still form of Silas Kane, at the dark pool spreading from beneath his head, at the iron poker lying beside him. Her mind refused to accept what her hands had done. But Cole's pain groan shattered her stupor, pulling her back to the world of the living and the dying. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. A strange cold clarity settled over her. She was the one who was whole. He was the one who was broken. It was her turn to be the strong one. "I have to get the bullet out," she said, her voice a stranger's, calm and steady. She did not know if this was true, only that it was what people did in the book she had read. It was a task, a purpose to cling to in the swirling chaos. With strength she did not know she possessed, she helped Cole to his cut, his arm draped over her shoulder, his weight a heavy, agonizing burden. He gritted his teeth, his face slick with sweat, but he did not cry out. She laid him down gently, then turned to face the grim reality of what came next. She heated his hunting knife in the fire until the blade glowed red, her stomach churning at the sight. She tore strips from her last clean petticoat for bandages, and then with Cole biting down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming, she probed the ragged, bloody wound in his shoulder. The work was brutal, intimate, and horrifying. Her hands, once trained in embroidery and the delicate art of pouring tea, were now covered in the blood of the man she loved. She found the slug of lead, flattened and misshapen, lodged against his collarbone, and managed to pry it free. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, a move that made him arch in silent agony, and then bound it tightly. He passed into a fevered sleep. The sun rose higher, and still Silas Kane lay on the floor. Nora knew she could not leave him there. The thought of touching him, of moving his dead weight, sent waves of nausea through her. But the thought of the law finding him in the cabin was worse. With Cole's spare horse, she performed the most gruesome task of her life, dragging the body out of the cabin and into the woods to a deep ravine where the meltwater ran fast and brown. She sent him into the current along with his pistol and rifle. She did not say a prayer. She returned to the cabin, scrubbed the floor until her hands were raw, and collapsed into the chair by the fire, shaking uncontrollably. She had erased the man, but she could not erase the act. She was a killer. Cole survived. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion for Nora. He hovered on the edge of death, his body burning with fever, his mind lost in a delirium where he called out names she did not know. "Sarah, Daniel." She nursed him relentlessly, forcing water and broth between his cracked lips, bathing his hot skin, changing his bloody bandages. She rarely slept, her ears tuned to every shift in his breathing, her eyes constantly scanning the tree for any sign of riders. The terror of being found, of having to answer for the body in the ravine, was a cold, constant companion. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to mend. The fever broke, and one morning, she woke to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. His gaze was full of a new, raw tenderness. He was weak, utterly dependent on her for everything. And in that vulnerability, the last of his defenses seemed to have washed away. As his body healed, the outside world began to press in on them. A lone prospector passed by the cabin one afternoon, and though he only stopped for a dipper of water, his presence was a stark reminder that their isolation was over. It was from him they learned that the town of Jericho, a small, hardscrabble settlement a day's ride east, was buzzing with the news of Silas Kane's disappearance. "Sheriff's got a posy out," the old man had said, stroking his white beard. "Seems Kane was tracking some runaway bride from back east. Folks are saying she must have done for him, turning into quite the story. A runaway bride turned murderer. The word struck Nora with the force of a physical blow. Her secret was no longer a secret. It was a story, a piece of gossip being passed from mouth to mouth, growing more monstrous with each telling. She saw herself through their eyes. A fallen woman, a black widow luring men to their doom. The weight of it was suffocating. That night, she confessed her fear to Cole. He sat propped against the wall on his cot, his arm in a sling, his face still pale. "I cannot live like this," she whispered, her voice trembling, "looking over my shoulder every minute of every day, waiting for a knock on the door. Every time you look at me, you must see what I have done, the trouble I have brought you, the blood on my hands." Guilt consumed her. She was a stain on his life, a danger that would never wash clean. "When you are stronger, I must go," she said, the words tearing at her throat. "I must." He reached out with his good hand and took hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "No," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "You will not." He pulled her closer, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Nora, look at me. The blood on your hands was shed for me. You saved my life. What trouble there is, it is ours now, not just yours," he pleaded with her, his eyes holding hers. "Stay. Please do not leave me." His words were a balm and a burden. She stayed, and for a few weeks they existed in a strange, stolen peace. The world seemed to hold its breath. They fell into a quiet, aching routine. They were not lovers, not in the way they had been for that one fleeting sunset. His injury made that impossible, but a deeper, more profound intimacy grew between them. They were partners, survivors, bound by a shared secret and a shared fear. He taught her how to use a rifle, her hands unsteady at first, but her eye true. She in turn read to him in the evenings from one of his few worn books. Together they repaired the splintered cabin door and rebuilt the section of fence his panicked horse had destroyed. They tended the land, planting a small garden with the seeds he had stored, acting as though they had a future here, as though time had stopped just for them. These were quiet, aching days, beautiful in their simplicity and heartbreaking in their precarity. Every shared meal, every sunset watched from the cabin step, felt precious and borrowed, a memory being made even as it happened. But their supplies were dwindling, and Cole's shoulder, though healing, needed medicine Nora could not make from bark and leaves. The trip to Jericho could not be put off any longer. Cole insisted on going alone. "It is too dangerous for you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They are looking for a woman. No one will give me a second glance." He rode out at dawn, and for Nora, the day he was gone was the longest of her life. The silence of the cabin, once a comfort, was now a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She kept his rifle close, her eyes scanning the horizon until they acted. In Jericho, Cole felt the town's suspicion the moment he rode in. Men watched him from the saloon porch, their eyes narrowed. Women hurried their children indoors. His face was not known here, and strangers were not welcome. At the general store, a wanted poster was nailed to the wall by the door. It was a crude artist's rendering, but the likeness was unmistakable. It was Nora beneath the drawing. The words described her as a fugitive from justice, wanted for the murder of Silas Kane. The bounty offered by Arthur Sterling had been doubled for her capture, dead or alive. If caught, she would hang. The storekeeper, a Weasley man with nervous eyes, recognized the direction of Cole's gaze. "A terrible business," the man said, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. "A woman like that, all poison and sin beneath a pretty face. The sheriff says it is only a matter of time. This is a big country, but not big enough to hide from hangman's noose." Cole bought his supplies, his face a stony mask, and rode out of that town with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The noose they were tying for Nora felt as if it were tightening around his own neck. On the long ride home, a terrible thought took root in his mind. He considered the unthinkable. What if he betrayed her? What if he turned her in? Perhaps a judge would show mercy. A prison sentence was better than death. He could save her life, her physical life, by turning her over to the very law that was hunting her. But as he imagined Nora in chains, her proud spirit broken, her eyes full of his betrayal. He knew he could not do it. He had seen the spirit that had made her flee St. Louis, the fire that had made her fight for his life. To hand her over to a system that would crush that spirit would be a different kind of killing. It would destroy the very essence of the woman he loved, and he would be the one to do it. He would not. Whatever came, they would face it together. He arrived back at the cabin as dusk was falling, Nora nearly collapsing with relief when she saw him. He did not tell her about the poster, about the increased bounty, about the word hanging. He could not bring himself to put that look of terror back in her eyes. Instead, he held her, his good arm wrapped tightly around her, and for a moment, they pretended they were safe. The pretense was shattered later that night. As they sat by the fire, a flicker of light in the distance caught Cole's eye. He went to the window, his body instantly rigid. On the ridge across the valley, a line of torches was moving through the darkness, bobbing and weaving like angry fireflies. A torchlight mob. They were coming for them. "They know," he said, his voice grim. "Someone from town must have followed me." There was no time for questions, no time for fear. Adrenaline surged through them. "The mountains," Cole said, grabbing a canvas sack. "We have to go now." They moved in a frantic, desperate rush, throwing what they could into sacks. Food, ammunition, blankets, the medical supplies. As they worked, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the roof. The wind began to rise, moaning through the pines. Another storm was coming, a dark and fateful mirror of the one that had first brought them together. Cole saddled his horse and hitched it to the now repaired buggy. They loaded their meager supplies and scrambled aboard. Cole took the res, urging the horse into the darkness, away from the cabin, and toward the high, treacherous passes of the mountains. Behind them, the line of torches grew closer. The shouts of men carried on the rising wind. The rain fell harder, turning the dry creek beds into rushing torrents. The night was pitch black, the buggy's single lantern casting a weak dancing light that only made the shadows deeper. They were ascending a narrow track cut into the side of a steep hill, a flooded ravine roaring below them. The horse, panicked by the storm and the shouts from behind, stumbled on the slick rock. The buggy's wheels slid over the edge of the track. For a heart-topping second, the world tilted sideways. Nora screamed as the buggy overturned, throwing them out into the darkness. She landed in the churning, icy water of the ravine. The current seized her instantly, dragging her down, her heavy skirts wrapping around her legs like a shroud. Water filled her mouth and lungs, the roar of the flood deafening her. She fought, her arms flailing, but the river was too strong. Her lungs burned. The dark water was pulling her into oblivion. Suddenly, a powerful arm wrapped around her chest, hauling her upward. Cole had her. He had been thrown clear and had dived in after her without a second's hesitation. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest, but he ignored it, his face a mask of desperate determination. He fought the current, his legs kicking for purchase, dragging her heavy, waterlogged body toward the bank. The river fought back, trying to tear her from his grasp, but he would not let go. He finally dragged her onto a muddy bank, and they collapsed, gasping and shivering, soaked to the bone. The buggy was gone, smashed to pieces in the ravine. Their supplies, their blankets, their food, all of it had been swept away. The shouts of the mob were closer now, the torchlight visible through the trees on the other side of the ravine. Cole staggered to his feet, pulling her up with him. They had nothing. No food, no shelter, only the clothes on their backs and the rifle he had managed to keep hold of. They were wounded, exhausted, and hunted. He looked down at her, his face streaked with rain and mud, and she looked back at him, her terror reflected in his eyes. In that moment, stripped of everything, they were all they had left. The law was behind them. The unforgiving wilderness was ahead of them, and there was no forgiveness to be found anywhere in the world. Their survival was no longer a question of choice or of hope. It was a simple, brutal fact. It now depended completely and utterly on each other. They were just two souls against the world. The mountain air was thin and sharp, burning in their lungs as they climbed. They moved through a landscape of stark gray rock and skeletal pines, leaving the world of men and mobs far below. Just as their strength gave out, they found it. An abandoned mining shack, little more than a collection of rotting timbers clinging to the mountainside, its roof sagging, its single window of vacant eyes staring into the abyss. It was a ruin, a ghost of a place, but it offered shelter. Inside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the walls. There was no hearth, only a rusty, dilapidated stove, but it was a refuge as they huddled together for warmth. The first snowflakes of a new, unseasonable storm began to fall, soft and silent. Within hours, the mountain was sheathed in white. Their tracks were erased, and the valley below vanished under a thick blanket of cloud. The snow that had once imprisoned them now became their shield, hiding them from the world. But their sanctuary was also a trap. They had no food, no medicine, and only one blanket between them. The cold was a constant gnawing presence. Cole's wound, which had been slowly healing, grew angry and inflamed from the dunking in the icy ravine and the relentless chill. Fever returned to his eyes, and a dark infection began to creep beneath the skin around the crude stitches Nora had made. He grew weaker by the day, his strength sapped by the fever and the lack of nourishment. Nora hunted, using the skills he had taught her, but the heavy snow had driven all game to lower ground. Her snares remained empty. She watched Cole waste away, his powerful frame shrinking, his skin stretched tight over his bones. The fear she felt was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, a terror far worse than any she had felt for herself. She was watching him die. On the 5th day in the shack, he was too weak to stand, his breathing shallow and ragged. She knew then that there was only one choice left. It was a choice she had been running from. But now it was the only path that offered a sliver of hope. She had to go back. She had to get help. She knelt by his side, stroking the damp hair from his forehead. He was barely conscious, his eyes half closed. "Cole," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I have to go to the town. I have to get a doctor. Medicine." His eyes fluttered open, and he tried to grab her hand, his fingers weak. "No, they'll hang you. And if I stay, you will die," she answered, her voice breaking. "I will not watch you die." She leaned down and pressed a gentle, desperate kiss to his dry lips. "I love you, Cole Maddox. I will not let you go." She took his horse, the one thing of value they had left, and rode out into the swirling snow. The ride down the mountain was a treacherous, near suicidal journey. The horse slipped and stumbled on the hidden ice, and the wind howled around her, a chorus of despair. But Nora held on, her resolve of fire in her belly. She was no longer running from her fate. She was riding to meet it. She was just outside the town of Jericho, on the main track, when the patrol found her. 3 men, their faces hard and grim under the brim of their hats, blocked her path. Their rifles were held ready. The sheriff was with them. "That's far enough, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. Nora pulled the horse to a halt. She looked at their faces, seeing no mercy, only a grim satisfaction. They had found their murderer. She felt no fear, only a vast bone, deep weariness, and a fierce, protective love for the man she had left dying on the mountain. Instead of fighting, instead of running, she did the one thing they did not expect. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and slid from the saddle. She held out her hands, wrists together. "I am Eleanor Hayes," she said, her voice clear and steady in the falling snow. "I surrender." She looked the sheriff in the eye, her only plea not for herself. "There's a man in the mountains. He is gravely ill. He needs a doctor. My surrender is conditional on you sending help for him." The trial was a formality, a piece of theater for a conclusion that had already been written. It was held in the saloon, the only building in Jericho large enough to hold the entire town. Nora stood before a long makeshift bench where a traveling circuit judge sat. A man named Patterson with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's brutal justice. The townsfolk packed the room, their faces a sea of morbid curiosity and righteous condemnation. They were not here to see justice done. They were here to see a hanging confirmed. The storekeeper testified, his Weasley face full of self-importance, telling the court how she was an outsider, a city woman who had brought nothing but trouble. The prospector who had stopped at the cabin spoke of her wild eyes and the fear he had sensed in her. Her story was told for her, twisted into a narrative of a seductress, a liar, a cold-blooded killer who had lured a bounty hunter to his death to protect her guilty secrets. She was a fallen woman, a Jezebel, a stain on their decent, God-fearing community. When asked to speak, Nora did not deny killing Silas Kane. "I did it to save a man's life," she said simply, her voice carrying through the hostel room. "He would have killed Cole Maddox. I acted in self-defense." A wave of scornful laughter rippled through the crowd. Judge Patterson banged his gavel for order, but his expression was grim. In this world, a woman's word, especially a woman like her, meant nothing against a dead man. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. It was then that the saloon door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray light, leaning heavily on the doorframe. It was Cole. A collective gasp went through the room. He looked like a ghost. He was gaunt, his face pale and drawn, his clothes hanging off his frame. His left arm was in a crude sling, and he swayed on his feet. But his eyes, when he found Nora, were burning with a feverish intensity. He had been found by the sheriff's men, brought to town, and tended to by the doctor. But against all medical advice, he had dragged himself from his sick bed. "This court is not finished," Cole said, his voice weak, but carrying an authority that made the room fall silent. He pushed himself off the doorframe and began the long, agonizing walk toward the judge's bench. The sheriff moved to stop him, but Cole waved him off. Every step was a visible effort, but he did not falter. He came to a stop beside Nora, and though he did not touch her, his presence was a shield. "You have the wrong person on trial," Cole said, his voice gaining strength. He looked at Judge Patterson. "Silas Kane was my kill, not hers." A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Nora turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "Cole, no." He ignored her, his gaze locked on the judge. "Kane and I had bad blood. Going back years, I knew he was tracking me. When he came to my cabin, he came for me. I was wounded in the fight. And Miss Hayes, she was my prisoner. She had nothing to do with it. She was a victim caught between us. I am the one who killed him. I am the one who put his body in the river." He was lying. It was a complete, desperate fabrication. A story designed to paint him as the villain and her as the innocent hostage. He was taking the noose from her neck and placing it around his own. He confessed to everything. His testimony a stark, unwavering declaration of his own guilt. He was sacrificing his life, his honor, everything to save her. As he spoke, Nora saw the sheriff's hard face soften, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. He had seen countless liars, thieves, and killers. He knew a man's character when he saw it, and he knew with a lawman's certainty that Cole Maddox was not a murderer. He was a man in love, willing to hang for it. When Cole finished, a heavy silence filled the saloon. He swayed, his strength finally giving out, and Nora caught him, holding him up. Judge Patterson stared at them for a long time, his fingers steepled before him. He looked at Nora, her face stained with tears for the man who was trying to die for her. He looked at Cole, weak and feverish, but defiant in his love. He looked at the hate-filled, hungry faces of the townsfolk. The judge was a tired man, weary of blood, weary of prejudice, weary of the petty cruelties that pass for justice on the frontier. "This court," he said at last, his voice ringing with finality, "has heard enough." He did not believe Cole's confession for a second, but it had given him what he needed, a way out that was not another grave. "I find the details of this case to be hopelessly entangled. I find guilt on all sides and innocence on none. This town has been disrupted enough." He stood, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "There will be no hanging today." A roar of protest started to rise, but he silenced it with a raised hand. "Instead, I am rendering a sentence of banishment. Cole Maddox and Eleanor Hayes, you are to be exiled from this territory. You will leave by sundown and never return." If you're ever seen in these parts again, you will be shot on sight. This is my judgment. Exiled and penniless, they were escorted to the edge of town as the sun began to set. The doctor had given them a few supplies out of a flicker of pity, and the sheriff had returned Cole's horse, a silent admission of respect. They had nothing else. Cole was still weak, swaying in the saddle, but he was alive. Nora sat behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, holding him steady. They did not look back. Before them, the vast, unknown expanse of the west opened up, a wilderness of endless plains and distant purple mountains. The future was a blank page. They had no destination, no plan, nothing but each other. A storm was gathering on the horizon, its dark clouds lit from behind by the fiery, brilliant colors of the setting sun. It was a beautiful, terrible, and hopeful sight. As they rode into the deepening twilight, Nora leaned her head against Cole's strong back. The air grew cold, and the first whisper of wind stirred around them. She thought of that first night, of the fear and the loneliness, and of the words she had spoken that had changed everything. She whispered them again now, not as a plea, but as a promise. "Don't let go of me tonight." He reached back with his good hand and covered hers, his grip firm and sure. His voice was quiet, but absolute, a vow spoken to the vast and empty wilderness. Not tonight, not ever. And so they rode on, two small, scarred figures against the immense landscape, vanishing into the growing darkness. They were fugitives, exiles with nothing to their names. But they were alive, and they were together in a world where justice had failed and law was a weapon. Their love had become its own country, its own law, its own redemption. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Heart of the Old West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.